The Battle of Britain was not fought over land, beaches or cities at first, but over control of the sky. Because in the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone in Western Europe, facing the possibility of invasion after the fall of France. Adolf Hitler's Germany had defeated or neutralized every major continental power in a matter of months, and from Berlin, the conclusion seemed obvious, that Britain would either negotiate or be forced into submission. For invasion to be possible, however, Germany first needed to destroy the Royal Air Force, because without air superiority, any attempt to cross the Channel would be exposed and unsustainable. This requirement shaped everything that followed, turning Britain's survival into a test not of armies, but of pilots, machines and systems working under relentless pressure. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was confident after its success in Poland. Norway, the Low Countries, and France, believing it could overwhelm the RAF through sustained attack and superior numbers, while British leaders understood that defeat in the air would almost certainly lead to defeat on the ground. The stakes could not have been higher, because if Britain fell, there would be no Western base from which Germany could later be challenged. Yet despite this danger, Britain entered the battle with significant disadvantages, including fewer aircraft, fewer experienced pilots, and an economy already strained by years of preparation for war. What Britain did possess, however, was time bought by geography, the Channel acting as a barrier that forced the enemy to operate at the limits of range and endurance, and a defensive system that integrated radar, communications, and command in a way no other nation had yet perfected. The Battle of Britain was therefore never a single clash or decisive moment, but a prolonged struggle in which every sortie, every interception, and every loss accumulated into pressure that tested both sides differently. Germany sought a rapid decision, believing Britain could be forced to collapse through concentrated blows, while Britain aimed only to survive long enough for German momentum to falter. This difference in objectives mattered enormously, because it meant that endurance, organization, and recovery would become as important as destruction. Before the first major raid was launched, the outcome was already being shaped by how each side understood the nature of the battle it was about to fight, and whether it recognized that air power alone could decide the fate of a nation. Germany's plan for defeating Britain from the air was built on assumptions formed during earlier victories. Because the Luftwaffe had never faced a prolonged defensive air campaign against an enemy fighting from home territory. In Poland, Norway and France, air power had worked in support of fast-moving ground forces, overwhelming opponents who were either unprepared or forced to retreat, and this success created confidence that Britain could be broken in the same way through concentrated bombing and attrition. The core objective was simple: to destroy RAF Fighter Command by attacking its aircraft in the air and its infrastructure on the ground, clearing the skies for an eventual invasion under Operation Sea Lion. German planners believed this could be achieved quickly, estimating that the RAF could be neutralized within weeks, an expectation that shaped the tempo and intensity of the campaign. The Luftwaffe organized its forces around fighter escorts, medium bombers and dive bombers, relying heavily on aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 for air superiority and the Heinkel and Dornier bombers for sustained attack. But this structure carried limitations, particularly in range and endurance over southern England. German aircraft operating from bases in France and the Low Countries had little margin for error, because fuel constraints limited time over target and reduced flexibility in combat. Despite these challenges, confidence remained high, in part because British air strength had been underestimated, and in part because German intelligence misunderstood how Britain's air defenses were organized. The RAF was not fighting as isolated squadrons reacting blindly to raids, but as part of an integrated system that prioritized interception efficiency over constant patrols, conserving pilots and aircraft for when they were needed most. This distinction was crucial, yet largely invisible to German planners at the outset. The opening phase of the battle therefore reflected German expectations of rapid success, with attacks focused on shipping in the Channel and probing strikes against airfields designed to draw RAF fighters into combat and wear them down. Early losses were accepted as the cost of progress, because the assumption was that Britain could not replace aircraft and pilots at the same rate as Germany. What the Luftwaffe did not fully appreciate was that the battle they were entering would not reward speed alone, but would instead punish miscalculation, because Britain's goal was not to defeat Germany outright, but to deny it the quick victory it believed was essential. As a result, the early phase of Britain's ability to resist the Luftwaffe rested on something far less visible than aircraft alone, because while fighters and pilots carried out the fighting, the real strength of the RAF lay in the system that directed them. At the center of this was Fighter Command's integrated air defense network, a structure that combined early warning, communication, and control into a single coordinated response. Radar stations along the coast, known as chain home, provided early detection of incoming raids, allowing controllers to identify the size, direction, and speed of German formations before they reached British airspace. This information was filtered through command centers and passed rapidly to sector stations, where decisions were made about which squadrons to scramble, when to launch them, and where to send them. The advantage of this system was efficiency, because British fighters did not waste fuel and pilots on constant patrols, but were committed only when and where they were needed, conserving strength in a battle where endurance mattered more than individual engagements. German intelligence was aware of British radar, but underestimated its importance, believing it to be a supplementary tool rather than the backbone of the defense. And this misunderstanding would have serious consequences. Equally important was Britain's command structure, which allowed damaged aircraft to land, pilots to be recovered, and squadrons to be rotated without collapsing the wider system. A pilot shot down over Britain could often return to fight again, while a German pilot lost over England was usually captured or killed, a disparity that quietly tilted the balance over time. Aircraft production also played a role because Britain was able to repair and replace fighters at a rate that surprised German planners, meaning losses that appeared damaging on paper were often absorbed without breaking. Fighter Command's operational capacity, morale within the RAF was strained but resilient, shaped by the knowledge that survival depended on collective effort rather than individual heroics, and that each successful interception bought time rather than victory. The battle therefore became one of management as much as combat, with British commanders constantly weighing when to commit squadrons, when to rest them, and how much damage could be sustained without losing control of the air. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, fought blind to much of this process, measuring success by aircraft destroyed, rather than by whether Britain's system itself was failing. As a result, while air battles raged overhead, the deeper contest unfolded quietly in operations rooms and communication lines, where information, timing, and restraint proved just as decisive as firepower. By the time German attacks intensified, Britain's air defense system had already shaped the battle into one of attrition that favored the defender, setting conditions the Luftwaffe would struggle to overcome. As the summer of 1940 progressed, the Battle of Britain entered a more dangerous phase because German attacks shifted from probing actions to sustained pressure designed to break Fighter Command through exhaustion. Luftwaffe raids increasingly targeted RAF airfields in southern England, aiming to destroy aircraft on the ground, crater runways, and disrupt command and control, believing that removing Britain's ability to launch fighters would be quicker than defeating them in the air. For those on the ground, this period became relentless, with squadrons operating from damaged bases, living among bomb craters, wrecked hangars, and constant alarms. While still expected to scramble at a moment's notice, losses mounted on both sides. But the strain fell unevenly, because British pilots were flying multiple sorties per day, often with little rest, and fatigue began to rival enemy action as a threat to effectiveness. Airfields such as Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Manston came under repeated attack, forcing rapid repairs and emergency relocations. Yet the RAF continued to function, not because damage was insignificant, but because the system absorbed it without collapsing. German commanders believed they were close to victory, interpreting the visible damage to airfields and aircraft as evidence that Fighter Command was nearing breaking point. But this assessment was flawed, because it focused on destruction rather than operational capability. Even heavily damaged airfields could often resume limited operations within hours, and squadrons could be shifted between sectors to maintain coverage. Meanwhile, British aircraft production continued at pace, and replacement pilots, though less experienced, were fed into the system to keep squadrons operational. This phase of the battle represented the Luftwaffe's best chance to succeed, because pressure on RAF infrastructure was real and cumulative. Yet it also exposed the limits of German intelligence, which struggled to distinguish between temporary disruption and permanent damage. While the fighting in the air appeared evenly matched, the deeper balance remained uncertain, because Britain's objective was simply to avoid collapse, not to dominate the skies. Each day, Fighter Command remained operational denied. Germany the conditions needed for invasion, and as the weeks passed without decisive success, time itself began to work against the attacker. The battle was tightening, not toward a sudden conclusion, but toward a test of endurance that would reveal which side could sustain pressure without losing coherence. And in that contest, appearances were increasingly deceptive. By early September 1940, the Battle of Britain reached a critical turning point, not because one side had been defeated, but because German strategy shifted in response to frustration and misjudgment. Having failed to destroy RAF Fighter Command through sustained attacks on airfields, the Luftwaffe altered its focus toward bombing London and other major cities, believing that striking the capital would force the RAF into a decisive battle and crush British morale. This decision marked a profound change in the nature of the campaign, because it relieved direct pressure on the very airfields and sector stations that had been under greatest strain, allowing Fighter Command time to repair damage, reorganize squadrons, and recover exhausted pilots. For British civilians, the shift brought devastating consequences, as air raids now targeted densely populated areas, inaugurating what would become known as the Blitz. Yet from a military perspective, the change inadvertently strengthened Britain's defensive position. German raids on London were large and dramatic, drawing RAF fighters into action over the city, where British pilots could engage closer to their bases and operate within the full support of radar and ground control. The Luftwaffe expected these battles to be decisive, but instead found itself drawn into prolonged engagements that increased losses without delivering strategic results. Crucially, the RAF was no longer fighting to protect damaged runways and fuel dumps, but to intercept bombers over open urban targets, a task better suited to its remaining strength. The German assumption that civilian bombing would break British resolve also proved misplaced, because morale, while shaken, did not collapse, and political will hardened rather than weakened. Each day, the RAF continued to operate denied Germany the air superiority required for invasion, and as September progressed without decisive success, Operation Sea Lion was repeatedly postponed. The shift to bombing cities therefore represented not escalation, but an admission that the original plan had failed to achieve its core objective. Although the Battle of Britain was far from over, the momentum began to shift quietly at this point, as Britain gained time to stabilize its defenses while German losses accumulated without delivering the strategic breakthrough required. The battle had entered a new phase, one defined not by immediate victory or defeat, but by the growing realization that the opportunity for a quick German success was slipping away, and that endurance, rather than shock, would determine the outcome. As the Luftwaffe intensified its attacks over London and other cities, the Battle of Britain became increasingly defined by attrition rather than decisive encounters, because both sides were now locked into a cycle of loss and replacement that favored the defender in subtle but critical ways. German bomber crews faced longer missions, heavier opposition, and mounting fatigue as raids pushed deeper into British airspace, while fighter escorts were forced to operate at the very edge of their range, limiting time over target and reducing tactical flexibility. For RAF pilots, the pressure remained constant, but the ability to land, refuel, and return to action from nearby bases meant that even heavily engaged squadrons could be rotated and sustained. Losses on both sides were significant, yet the impact was uneven, because a British pilot shot down over England often survived to fly again, while a German pilot lost over Britain was usually removed from the campaign entirely. This imbalance grew over time, quietly eroding the Luftwaffe's experienced aircrew base and replacing it with less seasoned crews forced into combat with limited preparation. Aircraft losses told a similar story, as Britain's production and repair systems continued to deliver replacement fighters at a pace that offset destruction, while German losses, though numerically comparable, were harder to replace quickly. The battle, therefore, became one of management rather than spectacle, with Fighter Command carefully husbanding resources, choosing when to engage fully and when to accept limited damage in order to preserve overall capability. German commanders, by contrast, struggled to measure progress accurately, often mistaking visible destruction for strategic success, and assuming the RAF was closer to collapse than it truly was. This misreading encouraged continued pressure without fundamental adjustment in approach, locking the Luftwaffe into a campaign that consumed strength without delivering control of the skies. For Britain, survival depended on maintaining this balance just long enough for German momentum to falter, and as days turned into weeks, it became clear that time itself was becoming a weapon. The Battle of Britain was no longer about who could strike hardest, but about who could endure sustained loss without losing coherence. And in that test of endurance, the structural advantages of fighting over home territory began to assert themselves decisively, setting the conditions for the battle's eventual conclusion. By October 1940, the character of the Battle of Britain had changed decisively, because what had once been a concentrated effort to gain air superiority had become a struggle the Luftwaffe could no longer control. Daylight raids grew increasingly costly as RAF interception improved, and German commanders were forced to confront the reality that sustained losses were no longer producing strategic gains. Weather played an increasing role, with shorter days and worsening conditions reducing the frequency and effectiveness of large-scale operations. While British defences grew more confident and coordinated with each passing week, the Luftwaffe began to shift away from daylight attacks toward night bombing, a move that reduced fighter losses but also removed the possibility of destroying Fighter Command directly, because night operations lacked the precision needed to neutralize airfields, radar stations, and command centers. For Britain, this transition was significant because it signaled that the immediate threat of invasion had passed. Even though the bombing of cities would continue, RAF Fighter Command remained stretched, but it was no longer facing the concentrated pressure that had threatened to overwhelm it in August and early September. German pilots and crews, many of whom had been flying continuously since the start of the campaign, showed clear signs of fatigue, while replacement crews lacked the experience to challenge British defences effectively. At the strategic level, the Luftwaffe's failure forced German leadership to reconsider priorities, because resources committed to the air battle over Britain were needed elsewhere, particularly as attention began to shift eastward toward plans for war against the Soviet Union. The postponement of Operation Sea Lion became indefinite, not through formal cancellation, but through neglect, as the conditions required for invasion were no longer achievable. For Britain, the survival of Fighter Command marked a turning point in the wider war, because it preserved the country as a base from which future operations could be launched, even though victory was still far from assured. The Battle of Britain did not end with a single announcement or decisive clash, but with a gradual recognition on both sides that the contest for air superiority had been settled in Britain's favour. What remained was not the question of whether Britain would fall, but how long the war would continue and at what cost, and in that sense, the battle's conclusion was less dramatic than its implications, because it marked the moment when German momentum in Western Europe first encountered a limit it could not overcome. While the outcome of the Battle of Britain was being decided in the air, its consequences were increasingly felt on the ground, because the shift toward night bombing brought the war directly into the daily lives of civilians across Britain. As the Luftwaffe moved away from daylight raids, German strategy focused on sustained attacks against cities, ports, and industrial centers in an attempt to weaken morale and disrupt production, a campaign that became known as the Blitz. For those living in London, Coventry, Liverpool, and many other cities, nights were marked by air raid sirens, fires, and the constant uncertainty of survival. Yet despite the destruction and loss of life, the anticipated collapse of civilian morale did not occur. Instead, daily routines adapted around shelter, blackout, and repair, creating a pattern of endurance rather than panic. From a military perspective, the continuation of bombing after the failure to defeat Fighter Command reflected Germany's inability to convert air power into decisive political outcomes, because while damage was real and suffering immense, Britain's capacity to wage war remained intact. Industrial production continued, aircraft factories dispersed and repaired damage rapidly, and transport networks, though strained, were never fully paralyzed. Crucially, the RAF remained operational throughout this period, defending the skies by day while adapting to the challenges of night defense. Even as resources were stretched thin, the Blitz therefore became a test of societal resilience rather than a tool of strategic victory, because it inflicted pain without delivering control. German leadership misjudged the relationship between civilian suffering and political collapse, assuming that fear would translate into pressure for negotiation. Yet the opposite effect emerged, as public resolve hardened and support for continued resistance increased. This dynamic mattered because it reinforced Britain's political determination to fight on, ensuring that military survival translated into long-term strategic resistance. The experience of sustained bombing also reshaped Britain's approach to civil defense, urban planning and wartime governance, embedding lessons that would influence later phases of the conflict. Although the Battle of Britain is often remembered through images of aircraft and pilots, this phase reminds us that air power alone could not force Britain from the war, because victory required not only control of the skies, but the ability to break the connection between a population and its willingness to endure hardship. By failing to achieve this, Germany confirmed that the opportunity for a quick decision in the West had passed, and that the conflict would become a prolonged struggle rather than a rapid conquest. By the late autumn of 1940, the Battle of Britain had reached a point where its outcome was no longer in serious doubt, even though fighting and bombing continued, because the strategic balance had shifted decisively against Germany. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy RAF Fighter Command, failed to gain air superiority, and failed to create the conditions required for invasion, leaving Britain intact as an active and defiant opponent. For German leadership, this failure carried profound implications, because it marked the first major campaign in which Nazi expansion had been halted rather than accelerated. Resources committed to the air offensive had been consumed without decisive return, and the loss of experienced pilots and crews could not be easily replaced. Forcing a reassessment of priorities, attention increasingly turned eastward, where plans for a future campaign against the Soviet Union promised the possibility of decisive victory on a different scale. Britain, meanwhile, emerged from the battle battered but unbroken, having demonstrated that survival was possible even in isolation, and that modern warfare could be resisted through organization, technology, and endurance rather than sheer numbers. The survival of Fighter Command preserved Britain as a base for future Allied operations, a factor that would later prove essential for the bombing campaign against Germany and the eventual liberation of Western Europe. Politically, the battle strengthened Britain's international position, signaling to potential allies that Germany was not invincible and that resistance was viable, a message that resonated particularly in the United States. Public confidence, though tempered by loss and exhaustion, was reinforced by the knowledge that the most immediate existential threat had passed. Militarily, the experience reshaped British air doctrine, highlighting the importance of integrated defense, pilot training, and industrial resilience in sustaining long campaigns. The Battle of Britain, therefore, stands not simply as a defensive success, but as a strategic turning point that altered the direction of the wider war. It demonstrated the limits of air power when used in isolation and exposed, the dangers of assuming that technological superiority alone could force political collapse. Although the conflict would continue for years, the failure to defeat Britain in 1940 ensured that Germany would face a prolonged, multi-front war rather than a rapid consolidation of power in Europe. In this sense, the Battle of Britain mattered not because it ended the war, but because it ensured that the war would be fought to its conclusion under conditions far less favorable to those who had once seemed unstoppable. The Battle of Britain ended without a formal declaration of victory or defeat, yet its significance became clearer with time, because it represented the moment when Nazi Germany's expansion in Western Europe was stopped by force, rather than negotiation. Britain's survival in 1940 ensured that the war would not be decided quickly or on German terms, preserving a base from which resistance could grow and eventually return to the continent. What made the battle remarkable was not a single aircraft, pilot, or day of fighting, but the way an entire system functioned under pressure, combining technology, organization, industry, and human endurance into a coherent defense. RAF Fighter Command did not win by destroying the Luftwaffe outright, but by denying it the conditions required for success, proving that control of the air depended as much on management and recovery as on combat performance. The battle also reshaped the understanding of air warfare, demonstrating that air power alone could not force political collapse unless it could break both military capability and civilian resolve, a lesson that would influence strategic bombing doctrines on all sides for the remainder of the war. For Britain, the experience reinforced the value of preparation and integration, as radar, command structures, and production capacity proved just as decisive as courage in the cockpit. Internationally, the Battle of Britain altered perceptions, showing that Germany could be resisted and that modern warfare was not predetermined by early victories alone, encouraging continued opposition and strengthening support among future allies. The cost, however, was real and lasting, measured in lives lost, cities damaged, and a population forced to adapt to prolonged danger, reminding us that survival came at a heavy price even without invasion. Today, the battle is often remembered through famous words and iconic imagery, but its deeper legacy lies in the quiet reality that Britain endured when defeat appeared possible and refused to collapse when pressure was greatest. The Battle of Britain stands as a reminder that wars are not always decided by conquest, but by the failure of one side to impose its will, and that sometimes survival itself is the decisive victory. In that sense, 1940 marked not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a longer war, fought under fundamentally altered conditions, shaped by the knowledge that even the most powerful forces can be stopped when strategy, resilience, and circumstance align.